Welcome to our audiobook chapter on the crash of 1929. In this chapter, we will be discussing the events leading up to the stock market crash, the causes of the crash, and its aftermath. This is a crucial moment in history that shaped the world economy for many years to come. Get ready to learn about the historical events that led to the Great Depression and the impact it had on people's lives. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the past to understand the present and future. The facade of the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum was strictly symmetrical, with mirror image cupolas, windows, and patient rooms in matching wings, as if the intention was to not tax troubled minds any more than necessary. Michael Meehan arrived in the summer of 1936 and stayed until the next June. He had always been considered high-strung, even among other brokers on the New York Stock Exchange, where he had spent more than a decade. Some people said Meehan got the same thrill from his work on the trading floor that stirs firemen in responding to a night alarm. He had been described at the end of one day's trading in March 1928 as being at the point of nervous exhaustion. Maybe that was because people saw him as the biggest man among Wall Street's speculators. He would make between $5 million and $20 million that year. But the 1929 crash would hit him hard, and 7 years later, the market would break him mentally. In 1935, Meehan had accumulated a large block of shares in Bellanca Aircraft Company at low prices and in his wife's name. In a time when trade information, including price and the number of shares, was disseminated on a ticker tape, he began painting the tape by making large prearranged trades at steadily higher prices, all between accounts Meehan already controlled, which meant that no change in ownership occurred. By painting the tape with substantial volume at ever higher prices, he expected to grab investors' attention and create the illusion that Bellanca was heading still higher and induce other investors to buy. Meehan drove the price from $1.75 per share to $5.50 over the span of a few months, at which point he sold his holdings to those investors he'd suckered. And without Meehan's machinations, the rally stopped, and the price per share fell back to its original level, with Meehan and his wife that much richer. Matched sales, the large sales at ever higher prices between accounts controlled by a manipulator, and the kind of stock pool Meehan excelled at, had been perfectly legal until 1934. This sort of dealing had helped push the stock market up 255% from the end of 1919 to its height in 1929, and then back down 48% in the next 56 trading days. It was the sort of thing Michael Meehan and men like him had done repeatedly, and Meehan had become famous and wealthy doing so. Meehan didn't get his start on Wall Street but near it, as a 20-year-old salesman at McBride's theater ticket agency on Lower Broadway. Meehan's customers were the traders and brokers in the neighborhood, and he would give them the best seats in exchange for reliable stock tips, eventually building a respectable portfolio for himself. Realizing he was in the right part of town but in the wrong business, he went to work as a clerk at the Curb Exchange, so called because its dealings were literally executed on the curb of Broad Street. Clerks like Meehan would fingerwag orders from windows to brokers standing in a mob on the sidewalk, where the orders to buy or sell would be executed. By 1918, Mehan had accumulated enough cash to buy a seat on the Curb exchange, and during his first month working for himself he cleared a mere $18. To make ends meet, he once again spent his nights selling theater tickets. But he kept at it, and 2 years later paid $90,000 for a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. Mehan and the NYSE would grow up together during the 1920s when he started serving as a specialist. A specialist is given a lucrative near monopoly over dealings in a particular stock in exchange for a commitment to maintaining an orderly market, even if it meant trading for his own account at a loss. By 1929 his brokerage firm, M.J. Mehan and Company, had 400 employees and owned 8 seats on the New York Stock Exchange, altogether worth $5 million, more seats than any other commission broker owned. Mehan's greatest success came as the specialist for Radio Corporation of America, RCA, a company that didn't exist when he joined the New York Stock Exchange. It initially traded on the Curb market, and at the end of 1921, RCA was trading for $2.25 a share. RCA became the most famous stock of the decade, rallying from that puny beginning to trade as high as $570 a share in 1929 as the radio went from a novelty to a luxury to a necessity. Mehan's history would mirror that of the American stock market, finding its place in the world in the 1910s, then growing and getting wealthy in the 1920s before despair and loss in the 1930s. In 1914, the prospect of war in Europe shocked American business. As European political positions ossified and as the continent lurched toward war, the front page of the New York Times reported on 31st July, closing of stock exchange not necessary, even though the Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost 6.9% the previous day. The New York Stock Exchange never opened that day. One report mentioned NYSE President Henry G. S. Nobel's discovery that the market was loaded down with big selling orders and almost bare of buying orders, and it didn't reopen until the middle of December. When trading resumed on 12 December 1914, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell another 16.80 points, to close at 54.62, a loss of 23.5% since its previous close in July. But the war turned out to be a boon for American business because the European combatants needed to buy nearly everything America's businesses made or its farmers grew. It became nearly impossible to not make money during the war years, and as the United States resolutely avoided direct involvement in the conflict, the stock market surged higher. The Dow finished 1915 at 99.15, a gain of 81.7% for the year, still the greatest one-year gain the Dow has ever enjoyed. The rally eased as the United States became a combatant in April 1917 but resumed at the start of 1919, and the Dow closed that year at 107.23, a gain of 30.5%. The Dow had nearly doubled in the 5 years since the end of 1914, as America was beginning to understand its place in the world and Michael Mehan was beginning to find his way on the Curb exchange. In Paris, they were known as the crazy years, while in the United States, they were the roaring 20s. As 1919 ended, Babe Ruth still played for the Boston Red Sox, and he was still best known as a pitcher. He'd hit only 40 9 home runs sprinkled across his 6 previous major league seasons. It was still legal to buy a cocktail or bottle of bourbon, and women still couldn't vote. Radio was still the province of hobbyists, with crystal sets and headphones listening to Morse code from ships at sea. And the financial world was still dominated by bonds and by those who had become investors for the first time by purchasing Liberty bonds, which had helped finance the war. The change began slowly, then accelerated. By the end of the first week of 1920, baseball fans learned that Babe Ruth had become a New York Yankee. By the end of the first month, it was illegal to buy that cocktail or bottle of bourbon. By the end of the year, women could vote for president, and by the end of the decade, most investors would have turned their attention from boring bonds to sizzling stocks. The war had turned Americans into investors in part because those who were trying to sell investments had become advertisers. The first Liberty bonds were issued in April 1917, less than 3 weeks after the United States entered the war. While buying them was seen as a patriotic duty, the Treasury wasn't taking any chances. More than 10,000 advertisements urging Americans to buy Liberty bonds appeared on billboards, buses, and streetcars in 3,200 cities. Mail-order powerhouses Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward mailed 2 million Liberty bond advertisements to farm families, while celebrities including Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin toured the country staging bond rallies. But each bond had a face value and minimum investment of $50, 2 weeks' wages for the average industrial worker. So in addition to becoming an advertiser, the Treasury sold Liberty bonds on the installment plan. A war thrift stamp costs only 25 cents. When 16 stamps had been collected, they could be exchanged for a $5 stamp called a war savings stamp. 10 war savings stamps would get you a $50 Liberty bond. Liberty bonds were the first investment many Americans ever made, and by the end of the war, 4 different series of bonds worth more than $17 billion had been sold to 20 million Americans at a time when there were only 24 million American households. Warren Harding had placed an inconsequential 6th on his party's inconclusive first ballot at the 1920 Republican Convention. When no consensus candidate emerged, the likable, inoffensive Harding slowly gathered support, and on the 10th ballot, he became the Republican nominee for president. After the first truly modern war, which had seen the introduction of both chemical weapons and the machine gun, Harding understood that Americans wanted a return to a simpler time, what Harding called a return to normalcy. Harding even conducted a simpler, more chivalrous campaign by staying at home in Marion, Ohio, and letting proxies venture out to handle the barnstorming. Harding was elected on 2 November 1920 with 63.9% of the vote. He became the first president elected when women could vote, the first who could not legally toast his victory, and the first to ride to his inauguration in an automobile. Once Harding started speaking after his swearing-in, he returned to the theme that had gotten him elected, saying, "Our supreme task is the resumption of our onward, normal way." One of the few things that didn't change was the Federal Reserve, which itself was new. The Federal Reserve System was part of the country's response to the Panic of 1907, when a single man, J.P. Morgan, with access to only private resources, stepped in to stop the chaos. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and the 12 regional Fed banks were expected to control credit and the flow of money while acting as the lender of last resort in a panic. As American soldiers were returning from Europe, Benjamin Strong, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since the founding of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, was not yet 50 years old. Strong was born in Fishkill-on-Hudson, New York, in 1872 to a respectable family of diminished financial circumstances. He had hoped to follow an older brother to Princeton University, but was forced to take a job. Reportedly fired from his first position due to poor penmanship, Strong in 1891 joined the investment firm of Jessup, Patton and Company, where he thrived, evidently in spite of his penmanship. Strong married Margaret Le Boutelier in 1895, and the couple moved to Englewood, New Jersey, where Strong enjoyed a bit of serendipity. Englewood was popular with the partners of J.P. Morgan and Company, and Strong became close to two of them, Henry Davison and Thomas Lamont. Strong joined the newly formed and Morgan-controlled Bankers Trust Company in 1904 after being recruited by Davison. Strong advanced steadily at Bankers Trust thanks in large part to the influence of his Englewood neighbors. Unfortunately, life intruded. Shortly after the birth of their fourth child, a chronically depressed Margaret took a revolver that Strong had recently bought for protection from a string of burglaries and shot herself to death in May 1905. The next year, Strong's oldest daughter died of scarlet fever. In 1907, just months before that year's October panic, in which Strong would assist J.P. Morgan so ably, he married Catherine Converse, the 18-year-old daughter of the president of Bankers Trust, Edmund Converse. In 1909, Strong became vice president of Bankers Trust following the resignation of Thomas Lamont, and then president in January 1914 on the retirement of his father-in-law. Strong would step down just 10 months later to become head of the newly formed Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But again, Strong's success was interleaved with tragedy. In 1916, Catherine abandoned him, taking their two children to California. That same year, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, requiring months of convalescing in the pristine air of the Cragmore Sanatorium in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Strong's visits to Cragmore went on for years, which meant that the central architect of the country's interest rate policy was often away from work for months at a time during the 1920s, frequently leaving Federal Reserve interest rate policy in less capable hands. During the war, things had been simple enough: keep interest rates low to help finance military spending, but after the fighting stopped in November 1918, the Fed was often wrong-headed in its approach. In November 1919, nearly a year had passed since the end of hostilities with Germany, and the Federal Reserve no longer needed to keep interest rates artificially low. While a broad-based decrease in production was sure to follow the peace as business moved from a war footing, Strong and the Fed failed to realize that such a decrease alone would be a sufficient damper on the inflationary economic growth seen during the war years. When GDP had risen by more than 20% 3 years in a row. Instead of allowing that natural contraction to do its work for it, the Fed on 3 November 1919 increased the discount rate. The interest rate charged to commercial banks by the Federal Reserve, and at the time the Fed's primary means of influencing interest rates and economic growth, from 4% to 4.75%, saying that the financial operations of the government, that is, borrowing to finance the war, will cease to be the important factor in shaping Reserve Bank policies. The Dow closed that day at 119.62, its all-time high and a level it wouldn't revisit for more than 5 years, as prices fell and the post-war economy slowed. The Dow lost 12.9% that month, the worst month of the decade, with the exception of December 1914, when trading had resumed after the outbreak of war. One newspaper said November's slump was due to the influence of credit restrictions upon speculation. But the Fed wasn't done, and it didn't wait long to increase the discount rate again, raising it from 4.75 to 6% on 22nd January 1920, and then to 7% on 1st June 1920, in another aggressive increase. The Fed had moved from 4% to 7% in just 8 months, and had done so in just 3 bellicose steps. One observer said the increase to 7% on 1st June supplied ammunition which professional traders seized to attack stocks, as the Dow lost 2.0% for the day. During the 8 months from the day the first increase became effective through 1st June 1920, the day the final increase became effective, the Dow lost 24.2%. Higher interest rates did more than just hurt the stock market, they throttled the entire economy. Agriculture was hit hardest by the slowdown. During the war, farmers had been encouraged to put every acre, even marginal land, into production. Now production overwhelmed the diminished demand. Between the summers of 1920 and 1921, cotton prices fell by nearly 2/3, and corn prices fell by 60% to just 65 cents per bushel. One measure of overall producer prices fell by more than 40% between 1920 and 1921, as unemployment rose from 5.2% to 8.7%. As unemployment grew and economic output shrank under the pressure of an economy weaning itself from war production and further burdened by rising interest rates, including the 11 poisonous months when the discount rate remained at 7%, economic output eventually declined by 16.7% in 1921. Unfortunately, the Federal Reserve learned the wrong lesson from this tightening regime. Instead of realizing that a more moderate course of rate increases could safely temper an exuberant economy, the sort of economy they would face later in the decade, they believed that raising interest rates resulted in collapsing prices and a painful recession, not seeing that the pace at which they raised interest rates was crucial. It wasn't just economic production and farm prices that were falling, wages were plummeting as well. In May 1921, US Steel slashed the pay of furnace workers by 20%, and maritime workers were striking to prevent similar cuts. Recognizing their overreaction, and as the potential for war flared anew over German reparation payments, the Fed embarked on a course of rate cuts as wild as the hikes they had instituted at the end of 1919 and throughout 1920. The first cut, to 6.5%, came on 5th May 1921, followed quickly by another to 6% in June, then to 5.5% in July, and to 5% in September before cutting again in November, when the discount rate reached 4.5%. In June 1922 they cut again to 4%, the rate that had prevailed during the war. Immediately after the war, the Fed slammed on the brakes. Now they had the accelerator to the floor. In response to this spasm of interest rate cuts, the Dow rallied 17.0% in less than 14 months in an amazing recovery given 1921's downward momentum. Surprised by the damage they had done, the Fed governors became reticent to exercise their mandate by raising the interest rates they controlled in an effort to modulate economic expansion and stop market speculation. Later in the decade, in the midst of what several contemporary writers came to call a speculative orgy, the Fed put off raising rates and then did so only modestly, never again approaching the 7% reached in June 1920, despite a festival of public hand-wringing about the dangers of speculation and calls for somebody to do something. Even as the orgy got out of hand by 1929, the Fed's discount rate finally reached a post-1921 peak of just 6% in September 1929, less than 2 months before stocks crashed, much too late to restrain the speculation. From 1921 to 1929, the Fed committed a grievous series of sins, and in doing so abdicated responsibility for managing the supply of money and credit in the American economy, the heart of its mandate, in an embarrassingly feckless display. The Fed's raising interest rates to restrain the 1920s decade-long stock market spree would have been good medicine if delivered in a moderate dosage years earlier. Delivered all at once after the disease had spread, it nearly killed the patient. Americans thought it was magical that sound could move through the air to be heard on the radio. In October 1919, the Radio Corporation of America was incorporated, and by the next month, it had acquired the assets of American Marconi, with the help of the federal government and RCA's largest shareholder, General Electric. RCA started trading on the Curb Exchange in 1919 and closed the year trading at just $2 a share. In many ways, it was the first consumer electronic startup. In February 1920, RCA fulfilled its strategic promise when it began offering transatlantic radio service, but another company, Westinghouse, would recognize the commercial potential for radio. Frank Conrad was a Westinghouse engineer with an 8th grade education who was eventually responsible for more than 200 Westinghouse patents, including the ubiquitous revolving electricity meter. In his leisure hours, Conrad set up a radio transmitter in the loft above his garage near Pittsburgh. Conrad's station was a hobby, but the technology he'd invented was a vast improvement over existing designs, and soon he was broadcasting songs or reporting sports scores and local news. When listeners started requesting airtime, Westinghouse convinced Conrad to turn his hobby into a business, and on 2nd November 1920, Election Day, Conrad's newly christened KDKA went on the air and announced to listeners from New Hampshire to Louisiana that Warren G. Harding had defeated James Cox for the presidency. RCA joined Westinghouse in commercial domestic broadcasting on 2nd July 1921. When it cobbled together a temporary station, known as WJY, in Hoboken, New Jersey, to broadcast the title fight between Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier. 300,000 listened as Dempsey retained his championship with a 4th-round knockout. In November, just 1 year after Conrad's first broadcast, Chicago's KYW became the 7th station to broadcast daily. With a steady stream of opera, it was also the first specialized radio station. Cigarette smoking was doubling and car production was tripling, but the radio was growing from nothing into the country's most important consumer product. Americans spent $60 million on radio equipment in 1922 as they started learning about the radio music in the air, every night, everywhere. Anybody can hear it at home on a receiving set. 1922 was also good for RCA stock and the stock market in general. Now that the Fed had reversed course and pushed interest rates lower, the Dow gained 21.7% to end 1922 at 98.73. Though RCA closed the year at just $3.88 a share, it had gained 72.4% after going nowhere in 1920 and 1921. The country had managed to shake off the effects of the war and of the Fed's ill-considered interest rate increases of 1919 and 1920 and the subsequent recession. The discount rate stood at just 4% at the end of 1922, the same level as at the end of the war. Now that the other Fed presidents had done an about-face on interest rates, Benjamin Strong started wondering if they hadn't gotten it wrong again. In a 1922 speech, he explained that he hoped to stop stock market speculators before they could damage the economy. As the stock market ran dramatically higher, the Federal Reserve didn't have the fortitude to raise interest rates meaningfully for 5.5 years. Early in 1923, Warren Harding was preparing to run for a second term. Despite suffering from the flu, he embarked on what he called his voyage of understanding, during which he visited more than a dozen states and became the first president to visit Alaska. But on returning to the contiguous United States, he experienced trouble. In a speech to 50,000 in Washington state, he referred to Alaska as Nebraska and had difficulty maintaining his balance. He complained of shortness of breath and indigestion, which his physician blamed on bad seafood. Harding seemed to be recovering, but on 2 August 1923, he slumped over while in bed with his wife and couldn't be revived. Harding was the 6th president to die in office. Calvin Coolidge became president early the next morning when his father, a notary public, swore him in by the light of a kerosene lamp in the parlor of the family's farmhouse in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Harding had been for normalcy. Coolidge embraced it even more earnestly, adding deeply held beliefs in lower taxes and the sort of isolationism that he hoped would prevent another foreign war. While 1923 would see the Dow lose 3.3%, from the day of Harding's death to the end of the year it would gain 8.3% while marking the start of what became known as the Coolidge Prosperity, punctuated by the new president's proclamation. The business of America is business. The stock market rally continued in January 1924, with the Dow gaining 5.4% for the month and closing at 100.66. The next month radio went beyond opera music and boxing matches, developing into a tool for politicians. Harding had installed a radio in the White House in 1922, but on 12 February 1924, Coolidge became the first president to deliver a political speech on the radio. 10 days later he went a step further and became the first to deliver a political speech by radio from the White House. It was carried on 44 stations. Thank you for listening to our audiobook chapter on the crash of 1929. We hope that you have gained a deeper understanding of the events leading up to the stock market crash, the causes of the crash, and its aftermath. This chapter is a crucial moment in history that impacted the world economy for many years to come. Remember, it's important to understand the past to make informed decisions in the present and the future. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more historical audiobooks and leave your comments and feedback in the section below. Thank you for listening.